All right, how many people do you think are here today? Estimate? Yeah, it's less than that. The first lecture after the first required lecture, after we drop everybody, is always a good day to gauge, how many people are actually going to show up. All right, so everybody in the room today, I'll try to actually learn your name today, if I haven't already. Then next week you can test me. All right, who's had the least exciting week? No? It's a trick question because the answer is me. I've had the least exciting week because I've been running training sessions all week for engineers. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? It is a beautiful day, isn't it? Why are we all sitting inside? Too damn bad. It's becoming apparent that the sun is setting way earlier. And I find that to be a particularly tragic part of year because it's really hard to play disc golf anymore. I can't go play disc golf after work. I have to go play disc golf instead of work, which, trade-offs. So the topic today is modality and heuristic evaluation. The readings you had were heuristic evaluation and then model human processor. And we'll do in the third of this lecture, we'll do the modeling human processes thing. But I want to start out, as we do, with a usability question for you. So, let's see. This is a website. It's kind of a famous website. Oh God, that was super wrong. So, has anybody in this room actually seen the movie Space Jam? Good, good. It was around when a lot of you were being born. They made this website that was considered revolutionary at the time. The Space Jam website where you could go and jam in space. And it's been around ever since. They have kindly left it intact, although you can see Warner Brothers moved it to their archive, apparently, which is probably appropriate. But this is a brilliant example of 1996 web design technology. I just want to explore it a little bit. And while we explore it a little bit, I want you to think about the heuristic evaluation paper that you read today, that book chapter, and think about what heuristics we might be violating or not violating here. So I got a bunch of stuff I can click. What should I click? Direct me. No, that's boring. Give me something else. The lineup. I like it. All right, we're going to the lineup. Okay. Oh God. The cast, the characters, the players, the tunes. When did Michael Jordan get into acting? Who are the monsters? All right, so we got a little bit of text. We got something spinning over here. That's fun. I like spinning things. Anybody have a guess as to what's going on right there? Yeah, so I probably can click that. This is an image map. People don't really do image maps anymore, but image maps used to be a thing where you could hover over different parts of the image and click things. So let's go find cast bios. That sounds like a good time. I like the frame. Got 2 frames over here. 1 frame just for the Space Jam logo. Cast bios of our characters. That's fun. All right, what else should I click? Planet. E. All right, this one has a different set of bios. Player bios, the NBA. Oh God. The NBA and related links. Did you know that the NBA has a homepage? You do now. I dig it. All right, what else? Let's try press box shuttle. That sounds like a winner. Oh no, no Space Jam news at the moment. That's too bad. You would think that in the past 20 years there would have been Space Jam news.
Jump station.
Jump station. I like it. Links. Links and other links. Should we try links or other links? Let's try links. Oh, no, that's just the same basketball links. Other links? This is bad. So, did anybody here have a GeoCities page? I had a GeoCities page. You have to be of a certain age to have had a GeoCities page, though. This is what all the GeoCities web pages looked like in 1995, 1996, when we all thought we were super, super cool because we could web page. Huh. Interesting. So that's a fun one. Now we get the actual current Warner Brothers shop webpage, but inside the Space Jam iframe. So that's kind of cool. Actually, it's not an iframe; it's just a regular frame. Huh. Sitemaps used to be a thing. I guess they still sort of are, but like a list of all the stuff on your website so that you could browse it and easily find things. And I bring this up today because this is sort of the context in which Jacob Nielsen was doing the heuristic evaluation work that he was doing. To suggest that the web was in its infancy is putting it kind of mildly when you compare what we have today to what was around in 1996. And the interesting thing is the technology, it has changed. I mean, there are different tools available now for sure. But more than anything, the design has changed. People actually sort of know what they're doing. And there had to be this phase of the web growing up where everybody kind of switched away from building their web pages in Notepad, which is probably what somebody was doing here, to building using more sophisticated tools, things like Dreamweaver. And now we're back into an era where everybody's doing their web design back in a text editor again, because people know the right patterns and the right things to build. Kind of interesting. If you can find old websites, they can often be a sort of source of inspiration. There was a lot of very brave content being put out on the web back in the mid-90s. Very raw content without a lot of polish on top of it. And so I think it's kind of fun to look at them for design ideas. There's also a cool website and I think an associated Chrome plugin called GeoCitiesify. It will take any random web page you're going to and apply make it look like GeoCities filter on top of it. It just makes random shit blank and puts the little man digging to tell you that the website is under construction on there, that sort of thing. So, fun times. All right, so the first topic today is heuristic evaluation. But to get to heuristic evaluation, we need to take a little detour quickly through, let's see, I need that. We need to take a little detour through modality. So what is a mode? Basically, a mode in the context of human-computer interaction, in the context of user interface design, is when the same user actions, be it a key press or a button push or a tap on the screen or whatever, have different effects in different situations, despite the fact that the input is the same. So can anybody think of examples of modes, things that I would mean when I talk about modality in computing? Yeah.
Like Vim, you could be in insert mode or delete mode.
Yeah, so Vim has this notion of insert mode or overwrite mode, delete mode. There's all these different things you toggle through, where hitting the A key will do very different things depending on what mode you're in. Okay, that's a good example. Others?
one rather than holding it. You just transfer it to a different.
Sort of. It's something we call kind of a quasi-mode, and we'll get to that in a second. Other examples of big modes. All right, well, one canonical example is just the caps lock. So whether caps lock is turned on or turned off is a mode of sorts. So hitting keys on your keyboard does different things depending on which of those two modes you're in, right? Same thing with like shift keys on calculators. This second key on this TI calculator says I don't want to do the thing on the key, I want to do the thing written in little tiny yellow text above the key. Something like this, where we have a literal mode correct spelling automatically that can be turned on or off. So if I type a misspelled word in the mode where that's turned on, then it'll get corrected. And if I type that word where it's not, it won't be. Generally, any place in a user interface where you see a checkbox is an indication that there's a mode to be turned on or off, that sort of thing. We talked about in Vim, but like a lot of different document processors have an overtype mode versus an insert mode that lets you toggle between putting in characters versus deleting characters as you type. Then there's this thing, and this is what's called a modal dialog. And in the desktop computing days, and actually still in a lot of desktop computing applications, you see these things where you're going along and you save your file, and it pops up a modal dialog and says, where do you want to save that file? Or you close out of the application and it pops up and it says, are you sure? We're about to delete your work. Would you like to save it before you quit? That sort of thing. Any of these, are you sure types of boxes. Why is this considered a mode? Why are modal dialogues, quote unquote, modal? Thoughts on that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so fundamentally it has changed what your input devices do, right? Like if you have your mouse and you try to click around back in here, you can't do it anymore because it has taken the focus away from that window in the background. If you were to keep typing, you wouldn't be able to keep editing your document in the word processor because you have this modal dialog up there that's taking all of the input away. And so it's this concept that we call focus stealing in the kind of desktop computing paradigm, where something pops up on top of you and takes away your keyboard. What's the problem with something like this, where like you're editing your document in WordPad and then suddenly Windows Automatic Updates pops up and says, hey, there's an update available. You want to reboot? There's at least two things bad here. Yeah. Indeed. So if you were just merrily typing along, doing your work, it turns out that typing either N, L, or Enter into that thing does some action. So if you were just cruising along and you weren't ready for the focus stealing modal dialog to come up, you might just, boom, reboot your computer. What's the other problem? The other problem is that it pisses you off, right? Like you were doing something, you were on your computer to get work done, not because you wanted to reboot the computer. And so you were cruising along, writing the next great novel in WordPad. And then all of a sudden this thing pops up and no longer are you thinking about whales and spears, but now you're thinking about, do I really want to reboot my computer right now? What if the update takes a long time? What if this happens? What if that happens? Maybe I should just go get a sandwich instead. And so it's really something that just takes away from your user experience on the computer. It's a bad thing. Another big branch of like, is it a mode or is it not a mode, is something like this. So this is the tool picker from Photoshop, where I can say I want to do the paintbrush, or I want to do the eyedropper, or I want to do marquee. And there's an interesting debate in the HCI literature and in the kind of design literature about whether this sort of thing counts as a mode, whether this is in fact a modal interface. Jeff Raskin, in his writings, would tell you no, this does not count as modality because it's the locus of your attention. It's the one thing that you are currently attending to. So if you're kind of actively switching between, all right, I want to be in eraser mode, and now I want to be in airbrush mode, and now I want to be in marquee mode, and you're like always kind of paying attention to what you're doing, it's not as much that you are in a mode as it is that you're doing a kind of direct manipulation thing, where it would be like if you had the eraser in your hand or you had the paintbrush in your hand. That's sort of the argument here. Where might be an exception to this? Where might the modes in Photoshop be considered modes in the kind of problematic sense? I can tell you when it's always a problem for me, at least, which is that if I Alt-Tab out of Photoshop, or Command-Tab, or whatever I do, and then I contemplate life for a little while, and by contemplate life, I mean watch something on YouTube, and then I come back to Photoshop, I will often do the wrong thing in my first action back in Photoshop, right? Because you're in some mode and maybe your brain was thinking you're in marquee mode, or your brain was thinking you have the eraser out, but you don't really remember because you were off attending to something else. And it's kind of like, the analogy is weird. This is where the direct manipulation metaphor of Photoshop breaks down. It's like if you were working at your artist's workstation and you had a paintbrush in your hand and you were painting along, and then you walked off and ate your sandwich, and then when you came back, you were given the tool that you just had in your hand, but you weren't allowed to see what it is. You just magically had a paintbrush in your hand. There's something that breaks down there about how people expect to interact with this tool. And because of that, you can sometimes get into these sorts of modal problems if you leave and come back. And so for our purposes today, we have this sort of formal definition of modality. A human-machine interface is modal with respect to a given gesture when 1, the current state of the interface is not the user's locus of attention, and 2, the interface will execute one among several different responses to the gesture, depending on the system's current state. So saith Jeff Raskin in The Humane Interface, which is an excellent book if you're looking for a admittedly dated but very interesting kind of overview to the sort of experimental sociological side of human-computer interaction. The Humane Interface is one of my very favorite books. And so we do use modes in user interfaces. They come up a lot, and it's because they're often useful. They're useful when you need to do something quote-unquote modal, when you want to temporarily restrict users' actions, or when the modes are really clearly presented and you want to switch back and forth between them, like in the Photoshop case. But they can be problematic. They have this big memory burden where you're expecting the user to kind of constantly remember what is it that the user is doing and why are they trying to do that. And they can be the source of many rather serious errors. And so you often see exercises in design books that are about looking at modal systems and thinking of different ways to make them not modal. How do you redesign the system to be modeless? That, or how do you integrate the modality kind of so tightly into the system that there's no threat that you'll forget what it was that you were doing and get off on the wrong track while you're working within the system. So this is just an example of a self-moding advertising stop sign that tells you exactly what the state of the intersection is. These 3 people also have stop signs. So let me give you an example. Here's a design exercise for you. Think about it for 1 second. Let's say you have a clock and it has 2 modes. It has show me the time mode and it has set the time mode, which you get to by either holding down or pressing the set button, and then you change the time by clicking advance to go from time to time. How would you redesign this thing to be modeless? How would you redesign it to avoid modes? Yeah.
Separate buttons for setting, like you said.
Separate buttons for setting what?
Advanced alerts and timing.
Okay, so you could kind of separate out the buttons. This coconut water is very dense. I was not expecting it to be so dense. It's borderline unpleasant. All right, so basically that's the sort of thing we're talking about here. So instead of having a set mode and an advanced button, screw that, just like get rid of those buttons and have like a plus and a minus button. Where does this become a complication? Good God. Where does this become a complication? It's when you start having too many buttons. So we had this example of like the clock radio in your car where maybe it can get out of control if you try to get rid of all the modes and you try to put individual buttons for every feature. Same thing with a calculator or a remote control, things like that. And so it's just this kind of design balance of how do I get the information that I need out there into the user interface without overwhelming people. I promised quasi modes a minute ago. There is this idea in the modality literature about modes that have to be consciously and constantly attended to. So for instance, holding down the shift key, people don't usually think of as a mode. They think of that as a quasi mode because you're actively like mechanically, physically engaged in doing it. Foot pedals on pianos, or quasi modes. Pull down menus, anything that kind of engages you physically with the system helps you build in this kind of memory map of when my hand feels like this, I'm in this mode. And so it's a little bit different from the set it and forget it sort of modes. And so you get things like this where you have, hold down function and hit this button to get the function key as opposed to getting, brightness up, brightness down, that sort of thing. Any questions about modality? Something that somebody's going to ask you on a job interview someday? Describe mobile systems. So, now you are prepared for life. Yeah.
I do have a quick question regarding, let's take an example of manual car.
Okay.
When you press the clutch,
Yep.
you shift.
Yep.
What is that considered? A quasi mode or just it is physical?
Yeah, I would call that a quasi mode.
However, you do change the speed of the car.
Uh-huh.
Would that affect the
So I think you have two different things there. I think the quasi mode is can I shift right now? Like is the clutch depressed? And then you have a normal mode, which is what gear am I in? Like am I in first gear or second gear is like a real mode. And a good example of one, in fact. Bad water. All right, so speaking of things that you're going to be asked on a job interview someday, we're going to dig into this heuristic evaluation thing. And what's interesting about heuristic evaluation is that if you have let's say you have a product manager or you have a head of engineering or a CTO or something, and they go out and they say, we need a UX person, damn it. Let's go interview some people for usability jobs. Anybody that does that only knows two things about people that do usability work. They know they need to have a little tiny background in statistics, and they know they're supposed to be able to do heuristic evaluation. It's like the one thing that everybody in the world knows about UX. So this is something that's actually worth learning. This will come up like again and again in whatever job you do because it's this sort of famous design method that has really made it into kind of mainstream pop culture knowledge of what user experience people do. And so what is a heuristic? A heuristic is a rule of thumb. It's something that describes a feature of a usable system, and it can be used in two ways. It can be used as a design principle. So if you recall, we've had several instances throughout the semester already where I've introduced a topic like cognitive ergonomics, and then we've tried to, from the field of cognitive ergonomics, derive some set of design principles. You can take the usability heuristics that Nielsen made or that anybody else made as that sort of set of design principles and use them to go out and build something. Then you can also use them in the way that is more common, which is as a post hoc method for evaluating a design, for going and deciding whether or not a thing like the Space Jam website is a good thing or a bad thing, whether it's well designed. And so you can come up with some arbitrary number of these things, right? there's nothing magical about the list of 10 Jacob Nielsen heuristics. They just happen to be super famous. But you could sit down and you could come up with a list of heuristics for X and a list of heuristics for Y, and you could try to apply them to any system. And indeed, there is this sort of thread in design literature and in the design community of trying to come up with heuristics for very different situations. So a good example of that is something that I work with quite a bit, which is there's a set of heuristics for API designers. So say you're trying to build a web API for some backend database or something. There's a set of usability heuristics for that. There's a set of usability heuristics for making new mice. There's a set of usability heuristics for building wearables. Anything you can think of, there's going to be some academic out there in the world who has sat down and tried to distill a bunch of research into a set of heuristics and design principles, and then help you apply those to the design problem that you're looking at. And like I said, this sort of technique, the actual application of heuristics to post hoc design analysis, was pioneered by Jacob Nielsen, pictured here looking extremely sinister. That's not inaccurate, I will say. He has that sort of sinister look anytime you meet him out in the world. And the technique is that you get 3 to 5 evaluators, and these evaluators are people that do heuristic evaluations for a living, ostensibly, typically. And if you go to a usability consultancy here in the Bay Area, of which there are a number, this will be a service that they offer. Among the things that a usability consultancy can do for you, they'll say, we'll come in and do a 2-week heuristic evaluation of your system. We have 5 experts that will walk through your whole thing. By the way, this service costs $100,000. Yeah. And that's just a thing that people do for a living. They go out and they do heuristic evaluations. And basically, they flip through your user interface, however it is, if it's a sketch or a paper prototype or the actual implemented UI on a website or an app, whatever it may be. And they go in and they walk through the UI and they check for compliance with whatever list of usability heuristics you've decided to care about. Ideally, the different evaluators, the 5 people or the 3 people or however many people you brought in, will find some different set of problems. Then when they're all done, they get together, they aggregate their results, and they kind of rank and assign severities and priorities to that list. And like I said, this can be applied to either real things or to early paper prototypes. And so Nielsen came out and he said, here are my 10 heuristics. They're very broad in many cases. Like a lot of the other sets of heuristics you'll see are a little bit more specific. There are things like, don't make buttons that move forward red. They can be that specific, but they can also be as broad as, user control and freedom. And so you will see as we dig into this and as you do the next assignment, which is a heuristic evaluation exercise, that there's an art to actually taking these things and applying them. This is a design challenge for the heuristic evaluation expert. This is not a QA exercise. This is not something you would put on Mechanical Turk and ask random strangers to do. There really is an art form to taking this list of heuristics and applying them to a design. And what we're going to do for the next little bit is just kind of click through these 10 things and talk about them a little bit. I think this is the more important of the 2 topics today. So I'll take my time with this, and if you have any questions, let me know. Uno, visibility of system status. So this is all about telling the user what is going on while they're using the system. And the classic example of this is the hourglass or the beach ball or the loading bar, progress bars. Things that tell the user, everything's cool, the system's still working, we just need a few seconds, we'll come back to you. It gets you into this sort of modal problem where maybe there's interesting work that the user could be doing while the background task is going on. And so giving them the beach ball instead of just letting them keep going with their work is a bad thing. But at least it's something, it's information. Wow, that is the same slide twice. I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, I see. I made the beach ball spin. Aren't I cute? Good for me. And then there's this other side of it, which is modal dialogues. So modal dialogues are these things that are intended to stop the user, make them read something, let them make an informed decision and move on. Again, the problem with it is habituation. So people have a tendency to just hit OK to anything that comes up in a modal dialogue. And so you have to be really careful that what you're showing them there is something that they are likely to have already known. It's typically used for redundant information. 2, match system and world. So this is about metaphor. So we had our lecture where we talked about like metaphor and mapping and how well do people understand systems based on what they already know about the world. So this is along that line. It's about speaking the user's language and following real world conventions. So the sort of anti-pattern here is something like this that we talked about, where on the older Macs, if you dragged the disk to the trash can, it ejected the disk. But like that's not how it works in the real world. If you throw your diskette in the trash, it doesn't eject. So matching system in the world. User control and freedom is the opposite of the modal dialogue, is the opposite of the like modal beach ball. Users hate being trapped. Users hate not having a choice about what to do next. And so when you get things like this, where the software comes up and it's like, your software requires that you restart the computer now. Would you like to shut down or restart? Like, that's sad. Everybody wants that third option, which is like, I want to keep doing what I was doing. And so giving these sorts of cancel buttons, ways to get out of dialogues, having undo built into the system is really key to making the user feel like they're in control of the system and that they can do what they want to do with it. And so you end up with things like this coming up, which is like, all right, seriously, I'm going to reboot in 4 minutes. But then you have another option. You can say like, yeah, postpone that for a couple of hours. Like, I'll get back to you. Cool. And then the sort of opposite of user control and freedom is the wizard, which we don't see as much in design anymore as we used to. But anything where you have like a gated series of modal dialogues, where like you have to do step 1, do step 2, do step 3, do step 4, that pushes the user down a fixed path that they have no escape from, is a violation of this particular heuristic of the user control and freedom one. Again, if anybody has any questions on these, just like jump up and down and wave. Consistency and standards. So being internally consistent is step 1. Don't have different parts of your application look different from each other and look stupid. Nobody likes anything that looks stupid. And then the other side of it is obeying conventions of your genre. So this might be a little bit hard to see, but this is a website for like a fancy boutique clothing store. And you have 2 options here. You can be a new customer, in which case you choose one of these 3 things, or you can be an existing customer, in which case you choose one of those 2 things. And an interesting thing happened to these people on their website a few years ago. Anybody guess what it was based on this design? The world changed around them in a way they didn't expect, and it caused them a graphic design problem. What might it be? So basically, these 2 things are headings that just have little fancy borders around them. But then material design came along, and buttons started looking like that. And so when people started coming to this website, they started trying to click those as if they were buttons. I want to be a new customer, or I want to be an existing customer. And this website actually could measure like a 20% loss in business because users' brains suddenly switched to material design and they couldn't click those buttons anymore. Like they didn't know how to proceed through this thing. So it's real. It's like a real tangible thing where a business is impacted by not kind of following the conventions of design that their users are expecting to see at this point. 5, error prevention. Error prevention is always better than error correction. So if you can stop the user from doing something bad in the first place, that's way better than helping them fix the bad thing that they did. And the key to that is eliminating error-prone conditions or checking for them and asking for confirmation. So we're back to this mobile thing where we pop up and we say, hey, you're doing something weird, something unexpected, something that we're not so sure you should actually be doing. Are you sure you want to do that? Now, that's one example of error prevention. A more classic one is something like this. So you'll often see date pickers on websites, especially for international travel. And the reason for that, the reason that like the airline industry was the first people in the world to invent the date picker for websites, which is true, is that they had this problem where some users would enter dates in the European format with the date, month, year, and some people would do the other way, the American format with month, date, year, and everything would go to hell on their airline reservation systems because you had to, they didn't know which date format was being used. And so the airline companies said, screw it, let's just build this little widget that lets you actually pick the date, and then there will be no more source for confusion and everybody will be happy. So this is a way of eliminating the possibility of the user making that particular error just by changing the widget design. And you see similar things in like Lego Mindstorms or Scratch or whatever we're calling Scratch here these days. Remind me? Snap, yes. Where you have some way that you can take two blocks and plug them into each other. Google's Blockly is also in this genre. And there's no way to put the two pieces together in a way that they don't fit because they have the little puzzle piece thing and it won't actually click together. Same sort of deal over here, where you don't even allow the user to put in incorrect input. There are two types of errors identified in the usability literature that are important to know about. There are slips and there are mistakes. So slips are when the user knows what they want to do, but just mis-executes. So they type the wrong keys and they have a typo, or they hit no to a dialog box they should have hit yes to, just because they're so used to hitting no to it, or they forget what mode the application is in. Things where they understand the system, but they just accidentally do the wrong thing. And then there are mistakes, which are places where you have a mental model mismatch. So more actual design problems where the user expects the thing that they do to actually have the right result, but then it turns out it doesn't because they misunderstood how the system works. Slips and mistakes, important to know. The granddaddy of all the like Nielsen heuristics, the one that every CS160 student remembers and walks up to people on the street and is like, recognition, not recall, is this one. So recognition over recall. And it's this notion that you should be able to present users lists of items to choose from rather than expecting users to memorize things. And so this was the big grand innovation of visual computing, of desktop computing, was that this is way easier to look at and remember what programs you have than this is, where you have to actually type in a thing and know that you even have the thing. So if I come in here and I'm like, oh, I need to use that program that makes block wire diagrams of circuits, but I don't remember what it is. Here, I'm screwed forever. Like, I'm never going to be able to figure that out based on the command line. But if I can just open up my applications, I can be like, oh yeah, fritzing. Fritzing was the thing that I wanted, and run fritzing and go and do that. So recognition over recall. This also comes up a lot in this notion of menus. So when the esoteric wackiness of Vim and I'm going to press colon and then A and then I can type sorts of hidden modes and things that you have to remember got replaced by menus in word processors, where instead I could say, like, I want to open this or I want to hit this. That really changed things. And then the same thing with things like this, where you have recent files. I don't need to even remember the name of the file or where I saved it or what I was doing. It's just on a list that shows up of things that I was working on recently. 7, efficiency and flexibility. These are about providing ways for experts to move faster than novices while still letting novices discover how the system works. And so accelerators are the big ones, keyboard shortcuts. So this is, for whatever reason, in the HCIO literature, almost always referred to as an accelerator. Things that allow you to not have to dig into the menu, but to just do the thing that you want to do directly. And then also having customization options that experts can use that novices don't notice and that don't get in the way of learning the system goes towards that sort of thing too. So macros and being able to like customize toolbars and drag things around, that sort of thing is a big deal in design. Aesthetic and minimalist design. So this is a heuristic that I find to be broad beyond usefulness, but it's kind of like, remember there's graphic design. That's a good heuristic. And so putting too much stuff on the screen, putting infrequently used items in too prominent of places, giving too much user attention to things that don't really matter is a violation of this heuristic. And basically you just want to do everything you can to zoom in on the most relevant information and really focus on what matters for your user. Same sort of thing with aesthetic and minimalist design. There's this idea that if you can get rid of something on the screen, you should. You should be kind of fighting your way towards the simplest solution to the problem that actually solves the problem instead of continuing to throw additional stuff. This also captures notions of ordering. So if you have like a system of things, recall like the BART ticket machine that we talked about a few weeks ago, where they had to put big numbers on the machine to be like, all right, you do this first, then you do this thing second, then you do this thing third, then you do this thing fourth. Better design leads to that sort of flow without explicit labeling. So just sort of helping people find the direction that they should navigate through a system and helping them find the thing that they need next. And indeed, there's been this kind of big movement over the past few years towards decluttering websites, decluttering apps, and going towards very simple things. Started 15 years ago, basically by Google, who took Yahoo's layout, which was here's a search bar and here's like 1,000 other things, and then just got rid of the 1,000 other things and left the search bar. Turned out that users just kind of liked that more. Let's see. Yes, fine. And then you end up with lots of things like this. There's just too much stuff. This is PHPMyAdmin trying to help you do whatever little task it is. And you end up violating this particular heuristic, mostly when you can't actually figure out what the user's task is. So good kind of task-oriented design gets rid of these things. Like if I know the user wants to find one particular item and change the type of it, or change a value of it, then I could walk them through that in a kind of more gentle manner. But if I really don't know what the user is trying to do, and all I can do is say, like, here's everything, that's where you get into these problems. Number 9, help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. So we did error prevention first. Yeah?
Can we talk about like the cultural constraints of the minimalism thing?
Sure.
It seems like a lot of Chinese websites will value complexity over minimalism. Just like a ton of time.
Japanese websites too, yeah. So there is no doubt that this is a design aesthetic, right? Like there is a current, this year, American aesthetic towards minimalist design that has pervaded lots of the world, but not the whole world. And so there's an interesting question there about would you build a different set of heuristics if you were working on a design project for Japan versus building for an American audience? And I think the answer is yes. Like you have to be aware of that, and I would bet you anything that if you Google right now, like Chinese web design heuristics, there's probably a whole separate list of 10 things that fits into that category. The other interesting thing about this is that like this has changed even in the US over time, right? So like the aesthetic toward minimalism is back, and it was there when Nielsen was making this list, but we went through like a 5 to 8 year hill of skeuomorphism in the middle, where suddenly everything had to look like a notebook in order to be a notebook. And that kind of veered away from this aesthetic and minimalist design thing. And indeed, if I had been giving this lecture 8 years ago, I probably would have said, this is how it used to be. Aesthetic and minimalist design was a big deal. Maybe it'll come back someday, and indeed it has. So I think you have to take all of these things with a grain of salt. Like, one, this work is 20 years old. It's still incredibly influential at this point, but it is a little bit dated. And two, you have to be smart. You have to be a designer. You're not being paid to go out in there into the world and just kind of blindly apply sets of rules. You're supposed to be looking at this kind of broader context and doing a user-centered design process and figuring out whether or not these types of things actually fit into the application that you're designing, the context of the work that you're doing. Yeah, very good point. Any other thoughts? I'm talking a lot today. It's because I have a list of 10 things I have to read. So it gets worse when it warms up. For anybody playing along at home, I do not endorse harmless coconut water. All right. I know it's beloved. I know it's beloved. I don't like it, apparently. All right, where am I? 9, help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. So we were trying to help people prevent errors initially. Now we're figuring out, all right, it's too late. We screwed up. An error has happened. How do we help the person recover from that? This is a bad example. This is an anti-pattern. You have not specified a web browser, or web browser specified is incorrect. That's too much. It's not the right information. It's not what you need to actually fix the problem, and it doesn't suggest a solution. The next slide is labeled good error messages. I question that a little bit, but this for a while was the kind of design direction people were going with modal error messages, where you tell the person, this is the problem, this is the scope of the problem, this is the action we recommend, and if you need more information, here's how you get that information. And this example comes directly from the Nielsen work. I think that this conflicts with some of the other heuristics, right? So that there's a push and pull on all of these things where we want to provide as much information as possible, but we were also supposed to be striving for aesthetic and minimalist design, and also we were supposed to be just getting out of the way of the user and not trapping them in a mode. And so, again, this is a design conundrum. You have a set of constraints. You have problems that your users will be experiencing. And the way you resolve those sorts of conflicts between good design principles is by actually doing user testing, going out in the world and seeing how the thing works in practice. And so that's what we'll be talking about 2 weeks from now, is how do you go from this sort of lab-based method of learning about usability questions into a more practical, hands-on sort of method. But the mother of all error recovery tools is undo. So if you can provide that, you've solved a lot of problems. And then 10, in what is by far the most too broad of the heuristics, provide help and documentation. Help should be easy to search, focused on tasks, as everything in task-centric design should be. It should list concrete steps to carry out, and it should be not too long. Good luck doing all of those things at the same time. Again, it's a design problem. There's all sorts of different types of help systems. So there's tutorials and getting started guides, which are less about kind of the mechanics of the system and more about the conceptual model. There are reference manuals, which are really geared towards experts. And then there are little, things like this, which is a tooltip, which was like a big innovation in 1995 when they came up with we could put tooltips on things. And these are just like little hints, notes within the system that tell you how to use it. Pretty powerful. Context-sensitive help has become a big thing lately. Search through help systems. And then also these kind of wacky first-run experiences. So this still happens a lot when you fire up an iPad app or something on your phone. And the first time you run it, it says, "Hi, welcome. I know you really I had this just today, so I was trying to pay for my parking spot because the parking meter was rebooting," which is ironic. I think the Internet of Things targets me specifically for little ironies here and there. Anyway, the parking meter was rebooting, and so I was trying to pay by phone, and I just wanted to pay, but I got into the app, and it's like, "Welcome. Let me tell you about the future of parking." I was like, "No, I've got to get to lecture. I want a sandwich before lecture." But you get these things, and now they walk you through and they tell you how to use the thing. But now I don't know how to get that back. If I ever do want to learn about the future of parking, I don't know how to do that in the Pay by Phone app anymore without uninstalling it and reinstalling it. And so there's this conundrum of this kind of weirdly modal thing where you're not sure how you're supposed to get back into it. Okay, that's the 10 heuristics. Actually running a heuristic evaluation is kind of the art of this thing. And I'll go through it pretty quickly. Basically, you bring in your experts and you train them. Hopefully you're working with a consultancy or something where you don't need to train them. But you really want to give them some context about the user interface. So things like we were talking about just a minute ago, like what culture is this going to be used in? What context is it being used in? What have we learned from the task analysis process? You teach to your evaluators, step one. Step two, they go off and they do their heuristic evaluation. They do a really quick pass through the system and then a very focused pass, and they produce their list of problems. Three, you bring everything back together and you try to establish severity ratings for each thing on this sort of general scale of cosmetic to catastrophic. And indeed, most usability problems in this world are cosmetic. They're things that you could do better, but it's not going to kill your user. But there are catastrophic ones too. And you kind of aggregate those. And then you come along and you debrief. You discuss amongst your team. You suggest potential solutions, and you assess how hard things are to fix. And this is kind of the handoff from the team of experts doing the evaluation back to the designer and the engineers as you start to establish what is the priority list for actually doing these fixes going to be going forward. And so if you remember our three arrows, we have this sort of design, prototype, evaluate cycle. This process, as described by Nielsen, was intended to be part of the evaluation cycle. The reason that we have it at this part of the lecture, or this part of the course, though, is that I think it actually applies to both. It's kind of a formative evaluation technique, which means that you can take just very rough ideas for how a user interface is going to work and use that during the kind of idea selection phase. It's kind of the end of the brainstorm is start applying heuristic principles to your ideas that are coming out of ideation and use that for idea selection and for initial kind of theory of design. So just as an example of the sort of output that comes out of a heuristic evaluation, an evaluator might say something like, typography uses mix of upper and lowercase formats and fonts. It's a violation of H2-4, which is typically something that you would just write on a screenshot of the app. You would just write a heuristic 2-4 on there. Here's a suggested fix, pick a single format. And this is the sort of thing that heuristic evaluation is good at because it's not such a bad problem that it's likely to come up in user testing. You get the idea there. And so assigning these severity levels is always a point of contention amongst design teams because everybody really, really cares about the thing that they found being fixed. And so negotiating that amongst a team of people working on this sort of thing can be challenging. And then kind of turning that around and turning it into action items is the end challenge of heuristic evaluation. So real quick, before we move on, I do want to talk about why we do heuristic evaluation. So heuristic evaluation is what we call a discount usability method. It is much cheaper to get in your little team of experts than it is to get in a team of experts that knows how to run user studies and then have them run user studies because that takes forever. You have to pay the participants, you have to pay the people running the studies, You have to pay for space. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into that part of the course, but like I've recently taken bids for running user studies. So I have products and I don't always have time to run user studies myself. So you can farm that sort of thing out and say, I want you to run a user study. You recruit the participants, you run the study, you hand me back the results. And when you get those sorts of bids back, they're typically in the like couple $1 million sort of range. Like it's not a cheap thing to have a company go and run user studies for you. This is much cheaper, very different from a full user study. So for heuristic evaluation versus user testing, it's much faster. You can talk about doing something useful in a day as opposed to multiple weeks. You don't have to be as interpretive about how the user is acting, which means that it is, while an expert gig, not as expert of a gig. It's a different level of specialization to be able to actually run qualitative and quantitative user studies. And then the downside of heuristic evaluation is that user testing is more accurate. You actually have results in context and from the field that will tell you a lot more about your system. And so it's good often in this design cycle to kind of alternate between doing heuristic evaluations and full user studies because you need to be able to kind of do both. They find different problems and you don't waste participants. This is a famous chart on usability problems on this axis, number or different evaluators on this one, and how many usability problems they found. So you need a number of evaluators to find different types of problems and to kind of cover the whole matrix. But it turns out you don't really need that many. So if you put 5 evaluators in, you get about 75% of the problems. And so if you have kind of a small project, that's usually enough to bring in like 5 evaluators, and the curves kind of look like this. You find that the number of problems that you find kind of tails off. There's a limit here around about 90%, where continuing to bring in more evaluators doesn't get you much more coverage. Meanwhile, the cost continues to rise, more or less linearly. So, in summary, heuristic evaluation is a discount method. You have people go through the UI, you have them note problems, they rate severity, you combine it into a list, and that goes back to design and engineering to fix. Cool? Thoughts? Questions? Yeah.
What is that discount usability method?
Just means it takes less time and less money than running a full-on user study. So it's a discount or budget method. Other questions? All right, quick administrivia, and then I'm going to hand off to the GSIs. Group brainstorm is due end of day Friday. Submit on B courses, just 1 submission per team. You should have like some magic fancy way to submit a team thing as opposed to an individual thing. So find your magic fancy B courses thing. Don't forget to read the instructions. Last time we did this, people screwed this assignment up in a lot of different ways. So like, take a breath, read the instructions, make sure you actually did what I asked you to do. The individual heuristic evaluation is up now, question mark? Soon? Soon. And when it's up, it's due in about a week. It runs concurrently with programming assignment 2. You will find that these tax very different skills in your head. So the heuristic evaluation assignment is not a huge big deal. And this assignment shouldn't be a huge big deal. So if you haven't started the programming assignment yet, do. Unlike last time, I am not going to be listening to, oh no, my Canoma code crashed when I tried it for the first time 25 minutes before the assignment was due, sorts of things. So take some time, make sure it works, make sure your assignment works. I'll show you a couple little videos and things afterwards, but if you haven't seen, I posted a thing on Piazza about how to use different screen sizes for the simulator. So if you don't want to work on the little QVGA Canoma Create screen, I would understand. Feel free to move to a bigger like mobile or desktop simulator for this assignment if that makes you feel any better. When we come back from studio, I'll show a few kind of exemplars from the programming assignment 1. A lot of you guys went really nuts with the like making 17,000 different screens and transitions and things between them, which wasn't really the intention of assignment 1. Like I really thought that could be done all in one screen and everybody would be happy. But anyway, we got some very interesting results out of it, and it looked very nice. And so I think you're probably better prepared for assignment 2 than I was expecting you to be. Group contextual inquiry, task analysis, competitive analysis will be the next group assignment. It's not out yet, but it will be down the road a little bit. And then programming 3 will be the last individual assignment, and that'll be nestled in that next set of things. Topics and readings for next week, still TBD. I really hate one of the readings that I was going to assign for you next week, so I'm trying to find a different one that I hate less deeply. And so I will find that, and we'll post them up probably tomorrow. Any questions before we do studio? Do you want to take a break for 5 minutes, or why don't we do that? Let's reconvene a little bit after, a quarter after. I don't know. And Garrett, this sucks. Sucks. Sucks.
Goodbye. No, it's the best.
I was like, is this a coincidence or
No, it wasn't. I walked into the store and I was like, okay, it's endorsed by.
I think they're
So,
really good.
It's okay, but it's kind of.
It's
painful.
not. I mean, if you like normal coconut water, that's what you wouldn't like.
I was not expecting it to be this dense. It has a specific gravity that I was not ready for.
Yeah.
So I'm finding it a little syrupy for while I'm talking.
Well, okay, that's fair. But it's not. I mean, I like it. You're just a Philistine.
I understand that you're wrong. I get it. Oh dear.
They are very expensive.